I noticed the coffee was cold only after the second sip. The first one I swallowed automatically, like I'd done every morning for years. The second one stopped me. At 59, life doesn't warn you with loud moments. It nudges you quietly. A cup you forgot. A room that feels too still. A door that closes a little more gently than necessary. She closed it carefully. Not to shut me in, but to keep the noise out. That soft click told me this meeting had crossed a line. I sat across from her, hands folded, listening to words I already knew how to translate. You don't get to my age without learning corporate language. Restructuring. Transition. Looking ahead. Polite words that always mean someone is being moved out of the picture. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicking. What I felt was smaller and uglier. I felt myself shrinking. Not as a professional. I'd made peace with that years ago. But as a man who had taken up space for decades and suddenly sensed that the room wouldn't miss him. She spoke evenly, professionally. But her eyes kept drifting, to the coffee, to the legal pad between us, to the window behind me. Anywhere but my face. That mattered. Because if she couldn't look at me, it meant this wasn't easy for her either. Months before that meeting, long before my name ever appeared in a quiet email thread, I had noticed her sitting alone after a late departmental review. Everyone else had left. Chairs pushed in. Laptops gone. She was still there, stacking papers no one had thanked her for organizing. I remember stopping. Just stopping. I told her she'd handled the meeting well. Not as HR. As a person. She looked surprised. Then, relieved. Like someone who hadn't realized how tense their shoulders had been. At the time, it cost me nothing. That's why it mattered to her. And why it matters now. Back in that office, she finally said it. Not the decision, the option. An early exit. Clean. Dignified. Quiet. No awkward goodbyes. No hallway pity. The kind of offer designed to keep everyone comfortable. Especially the people who don't have to leave. She framed it as a kindness. And maybe it was. But kindness can still corner you. This is where the choice really lived. Not on paper. Not in policy. In the narrow space between what you've earned and what you're willing to accept without protest. I thought about my mornings. About arriving early not to impress anyone, but because I liked the silence before the building woke up. I thought about younger managers smiling too carefully around me, already practicing a future without me in it. I caught myself thinking something I didn't like. How unfair it felt that this was so easy for them. I hated that thought, and the fact that it was true. It would have been simple to agree, to leave intact, to let the story end neatly, to be remembered as the guy who handled it well. And then another thought surfaced, rougher and harder to swallow. I didn't want my last chapter written by people who didn't know my habits, my history, or my name without checking a file. I didn't want to disappear politely. Her voice softened when she said, "You don't have to decide today." And I saw it then. Not pity. Recognition. She knew exactly what this moment cost. Maybe because she'd felt it herself, walking into a company that measured her age before it measured her experience. I looked at her and almost smiled. Almost. Because this wasn't rebellion. And it wasn't pride. It was self-respect. The kind you either protect or quietly trade away and regret later. I told her I needed time. She nodded. Too quickly. Relief passed over her face before she could hide it. Not because she'd avoided conflict, but because she hadn't lost faith in me. When I stepped into the hallway, it felt longer than usual. Every footstep echoed. For the first time in years, I didn't know what my badge would mean the next morning. That uncertainty followed me all the way to my car and settled into the silence. Here's something people don't like to say out loud. At 59, the fear isn't starting over. It's ending something by agreeing with people who already decided you were finished. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, realizing that whatever choice I made wouldn't protect my job. It would expose how much I still valued myself. And that realization, quiet, uncomfortable, irreversible, changed the shape of everything that came next. They asked me a question in the hallway that had nothing to do with work. Are you leaving? It came from someone I barely knew, someone young enough to still believe questions like that had clean answers. I smiled, gave a vague nod, and kept walking. But the truth is, that single sentence followed me the rest of the day. Because when people start asking, it means the decision is already leaking out. And once that happens, time begins to press differently. I want you to understand something about what comes after a moment like the one I described before. There's no dramatic fallout. No immediate consequence. Just a subtle shift. Doors don't close. They hesitate. Conversations don't stop. They shorten. And somewhere between your second meeting and your third cup of coffee, you realize you're being observed in a new way, as if you've already become a story people are preparing to tell without you. She avoided me that week. Not obviously. Not coldly. Just carefully. Emails were efficient. Meetings stayed professional. If episode 1 was about being seen too clearly, this part was about being seen too much. I could feel the weight of interpretation hanging over every interaction. And that's when I understood something uncomfortable. Proximity now carried risk. For both of us. Before all this, she had been the only one who didn't rush past me in the mornings. The only one who asked how my weekend went and waited for the answer. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Kindness ages quietly. You don't notice it while it's happening. You only recognize its value when it becomes rare. One evening, I stayed late finishing a report no one had officially asked for yet. Old habit. When you reach my age, habits are safer than hope. She walked past my office, stopped, and hesitated. That pause, barely a second, told me everything. She stepped in anyway. She didn't talk about the decision. She didn't mention timelines or options. She asked if I was sleeping well. It was such a simple question that it nearly disarmed me. I realized then how few people ask that once they stop needing something from you. I answered honestly, told her sleep comes in pieces these days, that my mind tends to wake before my body does. She nodded, not sympathetically, but knowingly. That mattered. Here's where the choice appeared again, quieter than before. I could keep things clean, distant, professional. Protect her position by pretending I didn't notice the concern in her voice. Or I could acknowledge what was already there, that we were two people standing in the same uncomfortable moment, each carrying more than our titles allowed us to say. I chose the smaller truth. I told her I appreciated her asking, that it made the building feel less empty. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, just enough to notice. That's when I understood why her opinion mattered to me. Not because she had influence, but because she remembered who I was when I had none to offer her. Word spread faster after that. A younger manager joked, too loudly, that I was handling this phase with real grace. I laughed with him, then hated myself for it. Grace is what people praise when they're relieved it isn't happening to them. That afternoon, I caught her watching the exchange from across the floor. Not interfering, not stepping in, just watching. Later, she found me near the elevators and said quietly, that wasn't fair. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement landed heavier than defense ever could. By the end of the week, the option became more real. Meetings were scheduled. My calendar began to look like a goodbye written in ink I hadn't agreed to use. And I realized the next choice wouldn't be about staying or leaving. It would be about whether I allowed myself to be diminished on the way out. The last conversation we had that week was brief. Almost too brief. She told me she needed to keep distance, for now. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. There was something unspoken in her eyes. Regret. Gratitude. Maybe both. That night, driving home, I felt the shift. Not fear. Not resolve. Something in between. The awareness that the kindness you give without calculation may one day return when calculation is all the world offers you. And that's when it became clear. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't just test my career. It would test whether I believed that decency still mattered when no one was keeping score. The meeting invitation arrived at 6:42 a.m. No greeting. No explanation. Just a subject line that read, alignment discussion mandatory. If you've lived long enough inside organizations, you know that word. Alignment is what they ask for right before they decide whether you still fit the picture they're drawing without you. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The building wasn't even awake yet. Outside, the street was quiet, but my phone felt heavier in my hand than it ever had. This wasn't HR language. This was management. This was pressure finally taking a shape. The antagonist, if I'm honest, wasn't a villain. It was a man in his late 30s with a clean haircut and a voice trained to sound reasonable. He had joined 2 years earlier and carried himself like someone who believed time was always on his side. When I walked into the conference room, he didn't stand up, just smiled and gestured toward the chair across from him, as if we were equals discussing logistics instead of my future. He spoke first. Calm, courteous, efficient. He thanked me for my years of service. Years. Plural. Past tense already doing its work. Then he said the sentence that landed like a quiet insult. At this stage, we need to think about what's best for momentum. Momentum. That was the word. Not performance. Not value. Momentum is what you blame when you want to move past someone without admitting you're pushing them aside. I nodded. That's the reflex. You nod, so they know you're listening, even when every part of you wants to interrupt. He explained timelines, transition packages, a story where everyone wins. And then he said it softly, almost kindly. We don't want this to get uncomfortable. That's when I felt it. Not fear. Not anger. Shame. The kind that creeps in when you realize the room expects you to cooperate in your own diminishment. Here's the choice they don't announce. You can leave gracefully and become an example they point to later. Or you can ask one question too many and become a cautionary tale. At 59, you're supposed to choose grace, silence, acceptance. That's what maturity looks like from the outside. But something in me resisted. Not loudly, just enough to matter. I asked him what exactly had changed about my work. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Long enough to tell me there wasn't a real answer prepared. He talked around it, used phrases like evolving needs and fresh perspectives. I saw it then. This wasn't about what I'd done wrong. It was about what I represented. Time. Memory. A reminder that not everything new is better. After the meeting, the floor felt different. Conversations paused when I passed. People smiled with sympathy they hadn't earned. One colleague patted my shoulder and said, "You're handling this like a pro." I thanked him and then went to the restroom and stood there longer than necessary, staring at my own reflection, trying to remember when professionalism became a synonym for disappearance. She didn't come to my office that day. That absence said more than any warning could have. I knew she was being watched too. Association carries weight when pressure starts moving downhill. Later that afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't meant to. Two managers near the coffee machine. One of them said my name, followed by, "It's probably time." They didn't see me. Or maybe they did and chose not to stop. Either way, it burned. Not because they were wrong, but because they spoke about me as if I'd already left. That was the moment I felt the real threat. Not losing the job, losing my standing, being reduced to a file that could be closed with a polite sigh. The internal choice arrived quietly, the way it always does. I could sign what they offered and preserve my reputation as someone agreeable. Or I could say something, carefully, firmly, and accept that it might cost me the clean exit everyone expected. I thought about her, about the way she had stepped in once, not loudly, but decisively, about why she had done it. Because I'd been decent when it was easy. That memory mattered now. It reminded me who I wanted to be in rooms like this. So I sent a message. Not emotional, not confrontational, just a request to formally document the reasons behind the decision, to slow the process, to ask for accountability instead of comfort. The response didn't come right away. When it did, it was brief. "We'll need to revisit this." That night, driving home, I felt the shift. I had crossed an invisible line. I didn't know what it would cost yet, but I knew this. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be leaving quietly just to make it easier for people who had already decided I was done. And for the first time since all this began, the fear I felt wasn't about losing my position. It was about holding onto my dignity and understanding that once you defend it, there's no going back to being invisible. It ended on a Tuesday, without an argument and without a scene. That was the strangest part. No raised voices. No final meeting. Just an empty calendar where my name used to be written in pencil, and an inbox that stopped expecting anything from me. If you've ever watched something fade instead of break, you know how unsettling that can be. Silence has a way of convincing you that nothing is coming back. The building felt colder that week, and not because of the air conditioning. People still nodded, still smiled, but the warmth had drained out of their faces. Conversations ended the moment I stepped into the room. Not rudely, politely, as if I were already a memory they didn't want to disturb. I realized then that the system doesn't push you out all at once. It steps back and waits for you to notice you're alone. She disappeared from my days entirely. No emails. No questions in passing. No pauses in the hallway. It was deliberate, and it hurt more than I expected. Not because I felt entitled to her attention, but because the absence felt like an erasure of something human we had both acknowledged. Distance, when it's chosen, carries a different weight. I told myself this was the right outcome. Clean. Predictable. The kind of ending people advise you to accept once you've lived long enough. I even practiced the version of myself who had already moved on. The one who spoke calmly about next steps and personal priorities. But at night, when the house settled and there was no one left to perform for, the truth pressed in. It felt like something unfinished had been sealed shut without my consent. The formal notice arrived 2 days later. Neutral language. Respectful tone. A final date circled neatly at the bottom. Reading it, I felt a dull confirmation rather than shock. This was it. This was how it ended, not with failure, but with polite agreement. I signed nothing yet. I just folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, like something I might need to remember later. What unsettled me most was not losing the job. It was the quiet certainty that I had also lost her. Whatever fragile understanding had existed between us had been deemed too risky, too visible. And I respected that. That was the problem. Respect makes it harder to fight back. One afternoon, I passed her office by accident. The door was closed. The light was off. For a moment, I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the nameplate. It occurred to me that this might be the last time I saw it. That realization felt final in a way the paperwork never could. Here was the internal choice, stripped of drama. I could accept this ending as complete and spare both of us further complication. Or I could acknowledge, privately and honestly, that something meaningful had been interrupted, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. Admitting that didn't change the outcome, but it changed how I carried it. I chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of restraint. I didn't reach out. I didn't ask for explanations that would only tighten the knot. I let the distance do its work. And for a while, it convinced me the story was over. Then, on the last full day before my departure, something small happened. Not a conversation. Not a gesture anyone else would have noticed. I found a document in my inbox, an internal note clarifying a timeline, correcting a detail that could have reflected poorly on me later. No message attached. No signature. Just accuracy where ambiguity had lived. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It was protection, quiet and precise. The kind you offer when you can't afford to be seen offering anything at all. In that moment, the finality I had accepted cracked slightly. Not enough to promise anything. Just enough to remind me that distance doesn't always mean indifference. That night, I didn't feel relief or anger. I felt suspended. Between an ending I could accept and a truth I couldn't dismiss. And as I lay awake, it became clear that what I thought was the end might only be the shape things took when they were being held apart, not let go. The mistake I had made was assuming silence meant completion. Sometimes it only means someone is choosing care over visibility. And once that thought settles in, The feeling of this is over starts to lose its certainty. I decided to sign the papers before I said goodbye to anyone. Not because I was eager to leave, and not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I didn't want my last day to turn into a negotiation with my own pride. At 59, you learn that dignity isn't a speech. It's a sequence of quiet choices you make when you could easily choose comfort instead. So I printed the agreement, read it one more time, and signed where my name belonged. No dramatic pause. No trembling hand. Just ink dated final. Then I made myself a promise that had nothing to do with the company. I would walk out the way I walked in, calm, decent, and without asking anyone to tell me I mattered. If you've never had to leave a place where you spent years, let me tell you what it feels like. It isn't a door slamming. It's a slow peeling away of routines. You notice how you don't know where to place your hands in the elevator. You notice how your badge suddenly feels like borrowed property. You notice how people speak to you like you're already halfway gone, which is their way of protecting themselves from the thought that one day it will be them. I kept my day ordinary on purpose. Finished what I could. Cleaned my desk in small stages so no one would gather to watch. I answered emails with the same tone I'd always used. I even thanked the young manager who'd been aligning me out of the picture when he passed by with his careful smile. That wasn't forgiveness. It was self-control. There's a difference. Around mid-afternoon, she sent a message asking if I could stop by her office at 5. One sentence. No warmth. No explanation. The kind of note you can show anyone without being accused of anything. I stared at it longer than I should have, because I knew that whatever happened in that room would be the last human part of this story. Here was my final internal choice. I could ignore it, keep everything clean, and leave without reopening what distance had sealed. Or I could walk into that office one more time and accept that some conversations don't exist to change outcomes. They exist to let you leave with your head straight. I went. Her office looked the same as always, neat, controlled, built for someone who carried other people's problems without letting them spill. She stood when I entered, not like a supervisor, but like someone receiving a guest. The formality of that small gesture hit me harder than any speech could have. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded. It's my last day. It felt right. She didn't invite me to sit immediately. Instead, she closed the door halfway, not all the way, and I understood the intention. Privacy without secrecy. Respect without risk. "I saw the final documentation," she said, her voice even. "I know you signed." "I did," I replied. "I wanted it done." A brief silence stretched between us. Not awkward, careful. The kind of silence that means both people are trying not to say the wrong thing. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Not for the policy, for the way it happened. That was the first time she'd used a personal sentence with me in weeks. It didn't feel like romance. It felt like decency returning to the room. "I don't need you to apologize for the company," I said. "I know what companies do." But I noticed the distance. Her eyes flicked down for a second, then back up. "You were supposed to notice it," she said quietly, "because it was the only way I could keep you from being pulled into something uglier." I exhaled slowly. The rumors. She nodded once. And the assumptions. People get careless when there's a story they want to tell. I leaned back in the chair she finally offered, feeling my shoulders loosen a fraction. So the silence was protection. "It was," she said, "and it cost me more than I expected." There it was. Not a confession. Not a promise. Just a fact. Plain, adult, honest. I looked at her, and, for a moment, I wanted to ask for something I had no right to request. I wanted to ask her to tell me that I hadn't imagined the connection. That I hadn't been a convenient project of empathy. That I'd been seen, truly seen, by someone who could have stayed safely indifferent. Instead, I chose the truth that mattered. "You know what I'm grateful for?" I said. "Not the meeting. Not the option. Not even the way you corrected the record for me." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and I knew she understood I'd noticed. "I'm grateful that months ago, when you were new and no one made room for you, I made a small gesture without thinking. And you remembered it. Because it means that the things we do, when no one is keeping score, still count. Her mouth tightened, as if she were holding something back. She blinked once, steadying herself. I remembered, she said. Because it was rare. And because you didn't do it to be seen doing it. That line settled in my chest like a weight and a warmth at the same time. I could have pushed then. I could have let the moment turn into something softer, more personal, more dangerous. I could have asked her to meet me somewhere after work, to keep talking, to see what this was outside these walls. Nothing explicit, just two adults trying to reclaim something good. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, and not because I didn't want it. Because I knew the difference between desire and responsibility. Because she still had to work here tomorrow. Because whatever affection lived between us didn't deserve to be turned into a rumor. So I gave her the only thing I could offer cleanly. I'm leaving with my name intact, I said. That matters to me. And it matters that you cared enough to help that happen. She held my gaze. I did care, she said. And I won't pretend I didn't. Another silence, softer now. Then she reached into a drawer and slid a small envelope across the desk. No label. It's not money, she said before I could react. It's a letter. Not about the company. About you. A reference, yes, but also a record. In case someone tries to reduce you to a date and a package. I didn't open it. I just placed my hand on top of the envelope, feeling the paper under my palm like something solid in a world that had been shifting for weeks. You didn't have to do this, I said. I know, she answered. That's why I did. There was nothing romantic in that exchange, and yet it was the most intimate kind of care I'd felt in years, the kind that protects your dignity without demanding anything back. I stood. She stood with me. We didn't reach for each other. We didn't make vows. We didn't pretend life was about to become simpler. At the door, I paused. If our paths cross again, I said, choosing each word carefully, I hope it's in a place where we can speak without weighing every sentence. Her eyes softened. If they do, she replied, I'd like that. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a plan. It was permission for the future to remain possible. I walked out of the building at 5:18 p.m., badge surrendered, hands empty. The sky was the color it gets in early fall, undecided between blue and gray. For a few seconds, I expected to feel either triumph or devastation. What I felt instead was quieter, acceptance. Not the kind that says, this was fine. The kind that says, this happened, and I stayed myself. I didn't win anything. I didn't lose everything. I left with my dignity, and with the knowledge that one decent act can echo back to you years later, in the only currency that matters, human respect. I don't mark time the way I used to. There are no milestones anymore, no anniversaries that demand attention. Days move forward without asking permission, and that turned out to be a gift. I found work again, not impressive, not permanent, but honest. A place where no one knew my history and didn't need it explained. I arrive, I do what I said I would do, and I leave without rehearsing how I'm perceived. That simplicity feels earned. Some mornings, I still wake early out of habit. The city looks different when no one expects anything from you yet. I make my coffee and drink it while it's hot now. Not because I learned a lesson, but because I finally have the time to notice it. There's a quiet dignity in being unremarkable again. I never heard from her after that day. Not a message. Not a follow-up. And that's exactly how it needed to be. What we shared didn't belong to a continuation. It belonged to a moment. To a decision. I sometimes think about her when I'm faced with a choice that would be easier if I stayed silent. I still choose carefully. That hasn't changed. As for her, I heard indirectly that she stayed where she was. Respected. Trusted. Still careful with the lines she draws. I imagine she kept the same office, the same calm tone, the same way of listening longer than required. People like her don't make noise when they move through the world, but they leave standards behind. We never crossed paths again. No coincidence. No dramatic second chapter. But every now and then, when I decide not to accept something that costs me self-respect, I know exactly where that instinct came from. And I suspect she knows too. Life didn't reward us for what we did. It didn't punish us either. It simply went on. And in that continuation, something stayed intact. Not a relationship, not a promise, just the knowledge that decency, offered without calculation, can return to you later in a form that doesn't ask for anything back. That turned out to be enough.